Is there any sweeter sound than a freshly peeled tempered glass panel cover? I simply don't think there is. Oh, how satisfying is that? And welcome back to the channel. Today, as you can see, we are using the NZXT H1 case, which has recently been released back onto the market after their whole debacle with the dodgy riser cables. That's now been sorted, so I've now got the opportunity to use this in a build. So without too much foray, let's get into it. Okay, so we're going to show you the parts that we are using today. Okay, now enough of the dodgy accents. The processor we're using today is the AMD Ryzen 5600X. It's so popular, it's so good, you cannot beat this kind of like single core raw performance for the money. This is actually a bit faster than a lot of i7s and i9s, though it's quite expensive, so you know, it's sort of a value proposition thing. Would you want to go for an i9 for only a little bit more money, or an i7 for the same price? You know, it's going to depend on your use case, but 5600X, if it's just a pure gaming box, this is really the one that you want. So that's a really great choice. And cooling that, of course, we've got the H1, so it comes with a 140mm liquid cooler in it anyway, so that takes care of that. The motherboard today is the B450, yes, B450i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi from Gigabyte. I got this on a really good deal, and the thing is with this case, it does add a lot of price to the, a lot of cost to the build, because it's quite a premium chassis. So we've saved a little bit of money by going for an Aorus board. But it's actually a really nicely built board, so it's got decent power delivery by the looks of it. Nice features, got loads of USB ports on it for an ITX, and it's got Wi-Fi built in as well. I mean, it's actually a pretty nice motherboard. It's a B450, but no one uses PCIe Generation 4 because the riser that this case comes with is Generation 3 anyway, and you're not really getting much benefit from the PCIe 4 lanes anyway. So the B450 is actually a really nice choice, and it does help save a little bit of money to make this an affordable build. So moving on next, RAM, we've got Crucial Ballistics. We've gone for DDR4 3600 CL16, which is kind of like the premium RAM. But on the channel, I don't recommend that you go out and spend loads of extra money just to get 3600 RAM, because it doesn't actually make much difference to gaming performance. The reason I'm using it today is because I had it around, and I actually got it on a really special deal. I got it for about £53 or something, this kit. So that's why I'm using it, but rest assured, if this deal wasn't there, I would be perfectly happy using 3200 MHz RAM. But RAM is RAM, so that's pretty boring, and storage is also pretty boring, let's be honest. But as always, our 1TB Western Digital SN550, just again on that sweet spot between price to performance and reliability from a really well-known brand. These just don't fail from my experience, so these are great drives. And the video card we're using today is the Gigabyte RTX 3060 Ti, and this is, I believe, the gaming OC version. And why did I pick this one? Right, so it's a 3-fan GPU, which actually fit in this case, which is pretty cool. But the reason I chose this one is you want something with a good cooler. In a case like this, cooling can sometimes be a problem, so you want something with 3 fans and with a nice heatsink on it. So that's why we went for this. And 3060 Ti runs a little bit cooler than a 3070 as well, so that's certainly going to help with the temperatures as well. It's not really the kind of case where I definitely wouldn't be putting a 3090 in this case if I could help it. Just because thermally it's not going to be a very good idea. Also, don't use the Founders Edition in this case either, because one of your fans is just completely choked off. But enough of that. Of course, the case we're using is the NZXT H1, and that also comes with a built-in power supply as well, a 650 watt gold rated unit. So that's really everything, and a lot of the parts actually come for free with the case. So happy days. So let's move on to having a look at the case itself and sort of how it's made up. So we've unraveled it from the foam packaging. And it is a little bit it's not very intuitive, you know, how you get this off. So you probably want to follow the instruction manual when using this case, even if you're a seasoned builder like me, because it wasn't immediately obvious what sort of the mechanism was here. But I did know from seeing other videos on the topic. But basically what you do is you sort of take the panels off and then slide the whole of the two side panels on the top. It all come off in one go, and you sort of just pull it in a straight line up to take it away from the rest of the chassis. And the case itself obviously comes with all the screws that you need. The riser is already pre-installed, which is very helpful. The power supply is already wired up and routed and everything, which does make this process a lot easier. There is a plate there to cover the PSU shroud for some reason, so take that one off and then put it back on when you're done. Also, the liquid cooler is already mounted, so all you need to do is then obviously mount it onto your motherboard, and then you'll be fine. And there's like a dummy motherboard made out of polystyrene in there, which you obviously take out when you put your own board in. But actually quite an ingenious design, I think. They've made really good use of the space, I think. So I think there's not really that much else to it, but I would definitely recommend, if you're using this case, take it slow and use the actual user manual that comes with the case, because that is really going to help you do things the right way. So at the moment in the clip you can see I've just put the RAM in, and because this is a B450 motherboard, we are going to need to update the BIOS before we put our 5600X in, and this is crucial. So if you don't have you know, an older Ryzen chip 1000, 2000, 3000 series lying around that you can use to update the BIOS, you're going to be a little bit shafted. So don't choose a B450 motherboard unless you've got the means to update it afterwards, because there's no flashback button on this case, so you will need to boot it with another CPU. And that's why I always keep an Athlon 200 GE lying around. It seems to be like a master key CPU. It seems to work even on B550 and X570 boards. They still seem to boot with the Athlon 200 GE. And I suspect that's because that's actually the CPU you can get on loan from AMD to do BIOS updates with. So I think they keep support for that in all of the AM4 chipsets, so that you can always update your BIOS. So you can see I'm just doing that now. And then I'll go through, update the BIOS, and then we can get on with installing it into the actual case. And you'll actually notice that the first thing that I installed was actually the video card. I don't know if that's what it tells you to do in the manual. I cannot actually remember doing this, but I just thought, get the video card in, get it out of the way. But I guess there's nothing really to stop you doing it afterwards either. I just had it there and I thought I'd just figure out how to insert that. And that is actually a fairly straightforward thing to do, because the riser's already fixed in place, so you just sort of plug it in and then you screw it in from the other side there just to secure it in place. So it's pretty straightforward to get that in, but obviously, as I said, follow the manual. It tells you how to do all of that. So what I'm doing now is I'm just unscrewing the there's like a flap mechanism for the radiator, which goes with our 140mm liquid cooler. So we just undo the screws and then it should just pull out towards you. This is a really cool system. This is excellent design. And then we can see we have our all-in-one liquid cooler block underneath that bit of foam there. So we'll just take that out. We also want to remove the dummy motherboard that they put in there just to keep everything nice and still. So we just wiggle out that piece of polystyrene there. So that's now out of the way. That's going to obviously allow us to put our motherboard in, which is going to be a crucial step in actually building the computer, obviously. So there you go. We've got our motherboard here. And again, I think it's going to be easiest if we tip this onto its side in a moment, but I think what I'm doing at this point is just looking around just to see what I need to do in order to get this motherboard ready. So I'm just sort of eyeing it all up, seeing what I'm going to do, and then of course whenever you're screwing a motherboard in, it's always easier to do it with the case sort of lying down on its back. So we turn it over there, and we sort of move all the cables out of the way. Try and just think about where your cables are going to be going and put them in a sensible place out of the way. And then you just sort of slide in your motherboard from the side after clearing out all that cable, so you don't have any cables trapped underneath the motherboard itself, because you're only going to shoot yourself in the foot if you don't check first. And I almost did forget here, don't forget to put your I/O shield in. Yeah, this would be something that's really easy to forget. I know a lot of modern high-end motherboards have it all integrated, but if yours comes with a separate I/O shield, make sure you put that in before you put the motherboard in, because yeah, I only just realised in time here, and that could have that could have been really annoying to get to the end of a build and realise you haven't put that in. So I'm glad I managed to find that. So rather helpfully, and this isn't true of most NZXT coolers, this one comes with an attachment that lets you just hook it on to the already existing mounting hardware on AM4 boards, which is really cool. And they've even already threaded the screw through and everything, so that's really cool. So you just clip on the AM4 bracket here, and then you just do, you know, the old classic AM4 mounting system that you get with Corsairs and all that kind of stuff. You just pop it onto the pump head, and then you just hook it over those posts on the mounting hardware, tighten it down, and you're absolutely sorted. The thermal compound's already on there as well. One of the key things as well, it says it on the pump head, so you shouldn't miss it, but just make sure that the pipes are going sort of to the left and the right, so that you're able to actually close the machine without crushing those pipes, if that makes sense. So they should sort of splay out, you know, legs akimbo style once you've finished getting it all ready. But yeah, I mean, this is another really good design point here that's just made it very, very easy to put this case together. And then of course, what you need to obviously be doing as well is plugging in your motherboard. So, you know, in the usual way, plugging in your front panel connectors, plugging in your CPU power, making sure you've got enough slack in the PCIe power cables to get round to the video card. There should be plenty of room. Obviously putting in the USB 3 header. If you've got a USB-C internal connector on your motherboard as well, also hook that one up. I don't actually have that on this motherboard, so we won't be using the USB-C. And other than that, oh yes, we've also got the HD audio connector as well, so don't forget to plug that one in. An extra thing that I did on this one is I plugged in 2 SATA data leads and just pre-routed them into the 2.5-inch bays that you also get on this case. And what that does, basically, it means that if you want to put a couple of 2.5-inch SSDs in there, or just one, you don't have to go about getting into the motherboard, plugging stuff in. It's already ready for you there. So I think that's something really useful you can do, is just plug in a couple of SATA cables already and just route them round into the drive caddy, and that would be a really good way to save yourself some time and effort in the future. Yeah, and here we are, just doing the final few bits now. So we've obviously closed up that radiator flap, screwed it back in with the screws, and now we're just hooking up some power to the video card, obviously so that we can get power on a video card. And then really, there's not much else to do with this case now. Just tuck those cables in so they're nice and neat. But don't worry too much about being super neat, just make sure they're nicely tucked out of the way, so it's going to allow you to put the shell back on at the end. And then here we go, so we're going to put the shell back on. There's a couple of rails on the side, so it doesn't just drop on the top, there are a couple of rails you've got to slide it through, so just keep that in mind when you put the top back on. And then obviously you can put all your panels back on now, so you've got the perforated panel, which goes on one of the sides, and it goes on the back actually, so you just pop that one back on. And then you just pop your glass panel back on the front as well, or you can leave it off for the time being whilst you sort of get it up and running for the first time, that's also fine. And what you'll have to do to plug all your cables in the bottom is actually just put the whole machine on its side so that you can get to the bottom of the case. So obviously this isn't a very useful feature if people are going to be changing things in and out of the rear USB ports all the time, because it's just not going to be practical. But if, like most people, you tend not to use the back I/O, changing things all the time, then you'll be just fine. And obviously one on the top isn't very many, but it's okay, it's doable. And you've got USB-C there as well if you have a compatible motherboard. Yeah, so there you go. You just plug in your power supply in. Now, one thing I did forget to mention earlier, and I'm very sorry that I forgot to mention this earlier, is that the power supply actually inside is off when it comes out of the box. So before you put all your panels back on, just make sure that power supply is flicked back on, because the plug in the bottom of the PC is not where the switch is between 1 and 0. It's actually on the power supply, so you need to make sure the power supply is on before you put your panels back on. And as I said, yeah, we've got it tilted, we're plugging in all the stuff that we need. And there's nothing really. I mean, you could sort of boot it in this position if you wanted to and start getting it running, but it's a bit better if you can just stand it up, just so you know it's going to work when you actually start it up. Okay, and here we are in the motherboard BIOS. Just going to set a few settings up. So the key ones that you want to do are the XMP profile. So make sure you put your XMP profile on. Another thing you can do in the chipset settings as well is you can also enable resizable bar in case you wanted to do that. I do it, but it's optional. It's not going to make a huge difference to your gaming performance. But something you really do want to change is the fan curves. All right, so the machine's actually only got one fan, hasn't it? It's got the one that's on the 140mm AIO, but there's also a pump within the radiator. Or maybe it's on the head actually that attaches to the CPU. I don't actually know. But either way, you need to configure the speed of both of those. So just what you want to do is go into the settings, set the one that has the pump on it, so the header that you plug the pump into. Just make sure that that one has got... I tend to go for quite a high curve, so starting off at around 80% and then putting the pump up to about 100% when the temperature reaches about 70 degrees. And then the fan, I go for a much gentler curve, so maybe 40% fan speed when you're at 40 degrees is quite good, and then sort of a curve that goes upwards. And I have 100% fan speed at 100 degrees, just because I do like. And then what you got to do is you got to put Windows on it, and then you make sure there's a few other things that you definitely install. So AMD chipset drivers, do that first before you connect to the internet. Reboot your PC, then install your video card driver. Even if it doesn't ask you to reboot after installing that. And then you want to install your other bits from your motherboard, such as the HD audio and the LAN adapter as well. Although a lot of these you can actually get them just from Windows Update as well, so don't worry too much about those. The main ones are the chipset drivers and the video card driver that you want to install, ideally when the machine is offline, but it's no biggie, don't worry about it. Yeah, that's really it, and then you can just get your games on and start having a bit of fun. And speaking of a bit of fun, let's roll some gameplay, and then we'll have some test results afterwards, a little bit of a chat, and then we'll be done. So we'll start by rocking a little bit of Fortnite, and on this video we're going to be using the competitive settings. So this is pretty much everything on low, shadows off, but we have the draw distance on epic so that you can see people from really far away. The only problem with playing it low is that the anti-aliasing isn't there, so it's a little bit rubbish in terms of that. So personally, when I play this game, I play it on high settings, but people often just want to go, what's the highest FPS I can get on this machine? So there you go. Obviously, it does become more of a CPU benchmark when you're playing at the low settings, but I don't know. I know people that buy computers and they quite like to see the really big FPS numbers because that's the most impressive. So there you go. So yeah, in this game actually didn't do too bad, you know. We got a few kills, and then it was kind of quite a disappointing way that I died because I didn't actually see this player, and just completely took me by surprise, and I just kind of messed it up. But that's a shame. I'm not very good at this game on mouse and keyboard. I normally play it on controller. I just thought I'd give it a go. But I do quite like Fortnite. It's quite a fun little game. But let's move on to something a bit more age appropriate, and that is Call of Duty Warzone. So I'm just rolling through the practice mode here just to give you a sort of a flavour of what you can get out of this machine. And we're getting around 200 frames per second in the practice mode, so that's pretty nice. When you're playing an actual online game, you can expect this to be 10 to 15, maybe 20% less frames per second, just because the map's a bit bigger, there's a bit more going on. But I think that's excellent performance, considering Warzone's optimization is nothing short of terrible. Getting this kind of frame rate is actually not bad at all. So there you go. So those are the two gaming scenarios, and then we've also got some temperature tests as well. And starting with Prime 95, our CPU torture test over 30 minutes. This was actually very surprising. So this was really good. So our maximum temperature was 71 degrees.
that's really good, actually. That's excellent, in fact. And the settle temperature was pretty much the same, so it was really handling those sort of spikes really well. So I was actually quite impressed with the CPU thermals on this, but granted, it's only a 65 watt TDP chip, so you'd kind of expect it not to get too hot. I certainly wouldn't be putting any Ryzen 9s in here. In terms of Intel, you could put an i9 as long as you do the 10900F, so that you get the lower TDP. I wouldn't be putting a 10900K or a 10850K in this. It's just going to absolutely roast that cooler. And I think also what helps is that the fan is set to intake, and generally when you use fans as intake off a radiator, the temperatures tend to be a bit better than doing it in exhaust, so turned out really nicely. The video card, on the other hand, was not quite as good. So in this one, we had 81 degrees Celsius on the OCCT stress test. I run this at the same time as the Prime 95 as well, so it's like a full system load. Now, 81 degrees is pretty high, but it's nowhere near throttling, okay? So you're only going to start to see the GPU slow down around 86 degrees, and that's quite conservative. Normally it's 90 degrees before it starts to really sort of choke itself out, and that's really just that's the case design, really, isn't it? You haven't got 3 big fans in the front of the machine pushing fresh air over the GPU, so obviously your temperature is going to be a little higher. And that's why you need to go for a decent model of graphics card with a nice chunky cooler on it, because I could see something like a Zotac being a lot hotter in this, so that's why we went for a nice Gigabyte gaming OC. So yeah, pretty alright. I'd say that's probably an alright score. Overall, I was quite impressed with the CPU temperatures there. And then in Heaven Benchmark, just to round us out, frames per second 182.1, score 4587. So that's pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a 3060 Ti. And it shows you that even though the GPU gets up to that temperature, it's not actually affecting the performance, because this Heaven Benchmark result is pretty much exactly on the money from what I'd expect from this kind of system that I've done in the past. So yeah, don't worry too much about the temperatures on the video card, alright? So there you go. I mean, I was really impressed with this case. I think it's just an exercise in design. I think it looks really cool. The base is only 19 by 19 centimeters, so it does look awesome. It's just such a unique and classy way to put together a setup. If you've got a minimalist setup or something, this would look really good on that. But there are certain things you don't want this case for, and that's if you're somebody that's very het up about temperatures. You know me, I'm very liberal with temperatures because in the real world it doesn't make a lot of difference, but again, with the temperature on the video card being a little bit higher, it's not going to be a silent machine by any stretch. Other people as well, maybe if you're going for super high-end components, so your 3080s, 3080 Ti, 3090, I probably wouldn't recommend this case for those, because those video cards get even hotter, so I don't think I'd want to be putting that in this case. Any kind of Ryzen 9s and unlocked Intel i9s is probably not a good idea either, considering there's no scope to improve the cooling in this apart from maybe putting a Noctua fan on the radiator. It's not going to be enough to make this a good enough cooling solution for a Ryzen 9 unless you want to run it at really low clock speeds, which kind of defeats the point of buying a Ryzen 9, doesn't it? So there you go. For mid-range builds, this is such a sexy case. It just looks really cool, very unique, and I was very happy that I was actually finally able to use it after they sorted out that riser situation, but not without its limitations. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. Please let me know in the comments what you thought about this case. I think it's very unique, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments and opinions as always, and don't forget to subscribe. And also don't forget that this PC, like all the ones on the channel, is probably available at jcpccustoms.com. As long as nobody's bought it by the time, making it, putting it up, and then making this video, it might still be available to buy, and it's a very nice PC. So, there's my plug. I'm going to say goodbye now. Have a great day. Catch you later.